The weight of the train was a familiar thing. 1,000 tons of steel and humanity, and it was all mine, an extension of my own hands. For 15 years, the Q line had been my world, a ribbon of steel weaving through the deep, dark guts of New York City. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track, the percussive ka-thump over rail joints, the hydraulic sigh of the brakes, these were the sounds of my office. They were predictable, mechanical, and safe. Tonight was no different. Or so I thought. It was a Tuesday, creeping past 1 a.m. The kind of damp, bone-chilling cold that seeps up from the pavement and makes the city feel lonely. My train was a ghost of its daytime self. The cars, visible through the small window in my cabin door, held only a handful of passengers. A girl in a puffy coat, head bowed over a glowing phone screen. An old man in a threadbare suit, asleep, his head rocking with the motion of the train. A couple huddled together for warmth, their conversation a low, indecipherable murmur. The rest were empty seats, reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights like vacant eyes. My name is Arthur, and I pride myself on being unflappable. You have to be in this job. I've seen it all: track fires, medical emergencies, fistfights over nothing. I've had people jump in front of my train. You learn to compartmentalize, to follow the procedure to keep the city moving. You become a part of the machine. The rumble of the tunnel is your heartbeat. We pulled out of DeKalb Avenue, heading south towards Atlantic. This stretch of tunnel is one of the older, deeper ones. The darkness outside the cabin window is absolute, broken only by the occasional signal light glowing a spectral green or red. The familiar sounds enveloped me. The low hum of the traction motors, the high-pitched whine of the inverters kicking in as I brought the train up to speed. I eased the master controller forward, feeling the familiar surge of power. That's when I heard it. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It wasn't the shriek of the wheels on a tight curve or the groan of stressed metal. It was a scream. It was short, maybe only a second or two, but it was sharp, high-pitched, and unmistakably human. It was a sound of pure, undiluted terror, and it sliced right through the symphony of the subway. My hand instinctively tightened on the controller. My blood went cold. The sound came from outside, from the tunnel itself, seemingly right alongside my cabin. My eyes shot to the in-cab monitor, which showed a live feed of the platform we just left. Empty. I scanned the darkness ahead. Nothing but the twin rails gleaming under my headlights, disappearing into the black. There was no one on the tracks. No work crews were scheduled for this section, not at this hour. My radio was silent. Control, this is Q train 7-5-5, south of DeKalb. Did you copy any reports from the platform? I said, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. A crackle, then the bored, tinny voice of the dispatcher, Maria. -7-5-5. All clear on the board. What's your status? What could I say? I think I heard someone scream. They'd think I was cracking up. Every operator has stories of tunnel ghosts or weird noises. It's usually just air pressure, screeching brakes, or rats the size of cats. You learn to tune it out. Negative control. Just a rough patch of track. All clear now. Copy that, 7-5-5. Proceed. I let go of the radio handset, my palms slick with sweat, a rough patch of track. A pathetic lie. No track noise sounds like that. That was a living sound. It was the sound of a throat tearing itself raw. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, panicked beat completely out of sync with the steady rhythm of the train. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a passenger on the platform screamed right as my train entered the tunnel, and the sound echoed in a weird way. But I hadn't seen anyone near the edge. Maybe it was a sound from one of the few passengers in the car behind me, but the sound had been external, sharp, and clear, not muffled by the glass and steel of the cabin door. We pulled into Atlantic Avenue Barclays Center. The doors hissed open, and the usual ballet of a late-night station played out. A few people got off, a few got on. No one looked panicked. No one seemed to have heard anything. I watched their faces on the platform monitors, searching for any sign of distress. Nothing. just the tired, blank expressions of late-night commuters. The doors chimed and slid shut. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves and push the controller forward again. The train slid back into the darkness. But for the rest of the trip to Coney Island, the familiar sounds of my office were no longer comforting. Every screech of the wheels was a potential scream. Every groan of the train's body was a prelude to terror. The darkness outside my window, once a familiar void, now felt like it was watching me. It felt like it was hiding something. When I finally ended my shift at the Stillwell Avenue yard, the cold, salt air from the nearby ocean did little to clear my head. I handed over the train to the next operator, a young guy named Leo, offering him a terse, "She's all yours." I didn't mention the sound. I didn't want to be the crazy old-timer telling ghost stories. Walking to my car in the employee lot, the silence was almost as deafening as the noise of the tunnel. But it wasn't truly silent. In the back of my mind, on a loop, that scream still echoed. Short, sharp, and terrifyingly real. I looked back at the sprawling, shadowy complex of the station, the tracks disappearing into the black maws of the tunnels. For the first time in 15 years, I felt a genuine fear of my job. Not of the dangers I could see, but of the one I couldn't explain. The next few shifts were a study in forced nonchalance. Arthur operated his trains with the same mechanical precision as always, his hands moving over the controls with an economy of motion born from years of repetition. He announced the stops, managed the doors, and kept his schedule. To any observer, he was the consummate professional. But beneath the surface, a low-grade hum of anxiety had taken root. The city above ground was entering the crisp, early days of October. The air was cleaner, the light golden, but down in the subterranean arteries of the MTA, the atmosphere was unchanged. A world of stale air, artificial light, and the lingering memory of that sound. He tried to rationalize it. Frank's words from their first brief encounter about the job echoed in his mind. The city breathes down here. Maybe that's all it was. A trick of acoustics. A pocket of air compressed by his train and a northbound R train in the parallel tube, forced through a ventilation grate at just the right pressure to mimic a human voice. It was plausible. It was logical. And he clung to that logic like a handrail on a lurching car. But logic offered little comfort when he was alone in the cab, the darkness of the tunnel swallowing the train. Each time his route took him toward the stretch between DeKalb Avenue and Canal Street, his posture would stiffen. His grip on the master controller would tighten, his knuckles white. The familiar screech of wheels on a curve, the rhythmic clatter over track joints, sounds he had long ago tuned out, were now scrutinized, parsed for any hint of the unnatural. He was waiting for it, dreading it, but also, in a strange way, needing to hear it again to prove he hadn't imagined it the first time. It was a Tuesday night, the city humming with a quiet, mid-week energy. His train was sparsely populated, filled with late-shift workers and the last of the evening's revelers. As he pulled out of DeKalb, the familiar sense of dread coiled in his stomach. The bright lights of the station platform receded, replaced by the hypnotic dance of signal lights in the oppressive dark. Red, yellow, green, the lifeblood of the system. He passed a signal marker, its green eye giving him the all-clear. The tunnel deepened, curving gently to the right. This was the spot. He held his breath. The only sounds were the whir of the traction motors and the rumble of the wheels. He scanned the track ahead, bathed in the train's powerful headlights. Concrete walls, conduits, and the endless ribbon of steel. Nothing. He was about to exhale, a wave of relief mixed with a bizarre tinge of disappointment washing over him when it happened again. Scree, it was identical. A woman's scream, high-pitched, laced with pure terror, cut short as if choked off. It wasn't an echo or an acoustic trick. It was raw, immediate, and filled with a pain that felt sickeningly real. It sliced through the mechanical noise of the train and went straight to his spine. This time, his reaction was physical. An involuntary jolt ran through him, his foot twitching toward the brake. He caught himself before he could apply any real pressure, the train continuing its momentum unabated. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't in his head. He didn't call it in. The memory of the dispatcher's bored, procedural response from last time was too fresh. What would he even say? The ghost is back. They'd have him in for a psych evaluation before his shift ended. This was something he had to figure out on his own. The rest of the run into Manhattan was a blur. He operated on autopilot, his mind racing, replaying the sound over and over again. Later, his shift finished, he found himself in the crew room at the Coney Island yard. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and disinfectant. A few operators were slumped in worn-out chairs, scrolling on their phones or staring blankly at the flickering TV in the corner. He saw Frank sitting by himself, methodically working his way through a crossword puzzle in the New York Post, a styrofoam cup of black coffee at his elbow. Frank had been with the MTA for 30 years. If anyone knew the system's quirks, it was him. Arthur poured himself a coffee that tasted like battery acid and walked over, trying to project an air of casual curiosity. "Hey, Frank," he started, keeping his voice level. "Got a weird question for you." Frank didn't look up from his paper. "If it's about a new way to get out of a weekend shift, I've heard it, and it doesn't work." His voice was a gravelly baritone, worn smooth by decades of cynicism. "No, nothing like that," Arthur said, pulling up a chair. "It's about the tunnels, the Q line between DeKalb and Canal. You ever hear anything strange in that stretch?" Frank finally lowered his paper, peering at Arthur over the top of a pair of cheap reading glasses. His eyes were tired but sharp. "Kid, the whole job is strange. You gotta be more specific. You mean the DeKalb groan, where the tracks settle, the water pumps near Canal, or the junkies having a sing-along in one of the service alcoves?" Arthur felt a knot of frustration. "No, it's a sound, a voice, like a scream." He watched Frank's face for any flicker of recognition, of shared experience. Instead, Frank let out a short, humorless laugh. He set his paper down completely, turning to face Arthur. "A scream, huh? Let me guess. High-pitched. Lasts maybe a second or two before it gets cut off." Arthur's heart leaped. "Yeah, that's it exactly. You've heard it?" The hope was extinguished as quickly as it had appeared. Frank shook his head, a look of patronizing pity on his face. "I haven't heard it, kid, but I've heard of it. Every couple of years, some new guy comes in here white as a sheet talking about the tunnel screamer. It's acoustics. Air pressure from two trains passing, metal fatigue on a section of rail, a bad bearing on a ventilation fan. It can sound like anything if you're tired and your mind wants to play tricks on you." He picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip. "You're hearing tunnel ghosts, Arthur. My advice? Stop listening for them. Focus on the signals, watch the track ahead, and get your train to the next station. That's the job. The rest is just noise." With that, Frank turned back to his crossword puzzle, the conversation definitively over. Arthur sat there for a moment, the lukewarm coffee growing cold in his hand. Frank's dismissal should have reassured him, should have provided the logical explanation he'd been seeking. But it didn't. It did the opposite. Frank knew the exact description of the sound. It wasn't just Arthur's imagination. It was a known phenomenon, a piece of underground folklore that the veterans had learned to dismiss. But Arthur couldn't dismiss it. It wasn't just noise. It was a scream. And if everyone else was content to ignore it, then he would be the one to find out why it was there. The phone felt slick with sweat in Arthur's hand. He had wedged it into the small space between the window and the control console, the camera lens peeking out into the rushing darkness. The audio recording app was open, its red record button glowing like a malevolent eye. He wasn't just driving the train tonight, he was a hunter laying a trap. The familiar rhythm of the wheels on the track, the rhythmic clack-clack, clack-clack, was no longer a comfort. It was the ticking clock of his own anxiety. As the train left DeKalb Avenue and plunged under the East River, the air in the cab seemed to grow colder, heavier. Every flicker of a tunnel light, every screech of the wheels against a curve, sent a jolt through his system. His eyes were fixed on the tunnel ahead, his ears straining to hear past the mechanical roar. He knew the spot was coming. A specific sequence of maintenance lights, a subtle shift in the tunnel's concrete structure. His thumb hovered over the glowing red button. There, the sequence of 3 yellow lights. His heart hammered against his ribs. He stabbed the record button. The train roared on. 1 second, 2. Silence, save for the cacophony of the machine. Was I wrong? Did I miss it? And then it came. A sound so sharp and full of agony it sliced through the industrial noise like a razor. It was a woman's scream, a raw, desperate shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't an echo, it was an event happening right now. Arthur flinched, his hand jerking on the controls, but he held the train steady. The scream lasted only a few seconds before being swallowed again by the tunnel's roar, but it left a vacuum in its wake. A chilling, absolute silence in his mind. Got you, he thought, a grim, shaky triumph pulsing through him. This time, I got you. He practically ran the last block from the station, skipping his usual stop for a coffee to decompress. Maria was already asleep. The apartment was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos in his head. He didn't even take off his jacket, heading straight for his worn armchair and pulling out his best pair of noise-canceling headphones. He plugged them into his phone, his hands trembling slightly. He took a deep breath and hit play. The recording was an assault, a wall of grinding, shrieking metal. The deep rumble of the train's undercarriage, the high-pitched squeal of the wheels on the rails, the percussive thump-thump of the track joints. It was all there, amplified into an unbearable racket. He scrubbed through the timeline to the exact moment. He listened, then listened again, cranking the volume until his ears hurt. Behind the industrial roar, there was something. A faint, high-frequency spike. A sliver of sound that, if you were already looking for it, might be interpreted as a scream. But it was nothing. It was a ghost in the machine, a meaningless artifact lost in a sea of noise. It wasn't proof. It was just another reason for someone like Frank to laugh at him. A wave of cold, heavy frustration washed over him, more defeating than the fear itself. The failure of the recording pushed him in a new direction. If he couldn't capture the present, he would have to excavate the past. His off-duty hours dissolved into a blur of screen time. The living room became his command center, the laptop his only tool. He typed in endless variations. Q train incident Manhattan Bridge, subway death DeKalb Tunnel, unexplained MTA delay Brooklyn, woman missing subway. He sifted through digitized newspaper archives from the New York Times and the Daily News, scrolled through conspiracy-laden transit forums, and tried to make sense of cryptic, jargon-filled MTA incident reports he found online. The words all blurred together. He grew pale, his eyes ringed with dark circles. "Arthur?" Maria's voice cut through his concentration. She was standing in the doorway to the living room, a mug of tea in her hands, her brow furrowed with worry. "It's almost midnight. You haven't moved in hours." "I'm close to something, Maria," he mumbled, not looking away from the screen. She came closer, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. He flinched at the unexpected contact. "Close to what?" "Honey, you're scaring me. You're not sleeping, you barely eat. You look haunted." "It's just a work thing," he said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "Something that doesn't add up. The noise you told me about, the one that other guy, Frank, said was just the tunnel." Her voice was soft, pleading. "Arthur, maybe he's right. Maybe it's just stress. This job, it gets to people. Maybe you should talk to someone or take a few days off." He finally turned to her, his eyes blazing with a desperate intensity that startled her. "No, it's not stress. It's real, Maria, I know it is. They're ignoring it and I can't. Don't you see? If I let this go, I'm just like them." The space between them crackled with a new kind of tension. She saw a man she barely recognized, not her steady, reliable Arthur, but a paranoid stranger chasing shadows. She pulled her hand back, a flicker of hurt in her eyes. "I just want my husband back," she whispered, before turning and walking quietly back to the bedroom. The silence she left behind was heavier than any scream. Arthur stared at the empty doorway for a long moment, the weight of his isolation pressing down on him. He felt more alone now than he ever did in the dark tunnels beneath the city. He turned back to the screen, his jaw set in grim determination. He had to find something. He had to prove he wasn't crazy. He clicked on another link, a tiny, almost forgotten article from a local Brooklyn paper from 6 years ago. The headline was mundane: minor delays on B/Q lines during evening commute. He almost clicked away, but then a line in the short text caught his eye. Service was briefly suspended due to an investigation of an unauthorized person on the tracks near the Manhattan Bridge approach. No individual was found, and service resumed after a 45-minute delay. It wasn't a body, it wasn't an accident, it was nothing. And yet it was something, a blip in the official record. A person who was there and then wasn't. A tiny, fragile thread. And for Arthur, sitting alone in the glow of his laptop, it was enough to keep pulling. The digital newspaper clipping felt like a thin shield against an encroaching darkness. It was the only tangible thing he had, a single pixelated column from 6 years ago. Unauthorized person on tracks disrupts Q line service. The words were sterile, bureaucratic, a world away from the raw, human terror of the scream. Arthur knew the online trail ended here. Public archives and forums were a dead end. He needed the official report, the MTA's internal paperwork that would have names, times, and details shielded from public view. The next morning, he took a bus to the MTA headquarters in Lower Manhattan, a sterile monolith of glass and steel that felt as welcoming as a prison. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of floor polish and quiet desperation. He found himself at a records request window, facing a clerk whose expression suggested she'd seen every flavor of human misery and was impressed by none of them. "I'd like to request an incident report," Arthur said, his voice sounding small in the cavernous lobby. She slid a form under the thick glass. "Fill this out. Reason for request?" He hesitated. "I'm haunted by a ghost scream and think this is related. Wasn't going to work." "Personal research," he mumbled, writing it down. "For a historical project on transit line safety." It sounded flimsy even to him. The clerk took the form, her eyes scanning it with practiced indifference. She typed the date and location into her computer. Her fingers paused. This was 6 years ago, a minor service delay. No injuries, no one apprehended. It's a low-priority archived file. Why this one? "I remember the delay. I was just curious about the resolution," he lied, feeling a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. She looked at him, a flicker of suspicion in her eyes before her expression flattened back into boredom. "If the request is approved, it could take 4 to 6 weeks to retrieve and process. We'll mail it to you. 4 to 6 weeks. The words landed like a death sentence for his momentum. He walked out of the building and back into the humid chaos of a New York summer, feeling more defeated than ever. The system was designed to forget, to bury these little inconsistencies under mountains of paperwork and decades of routine. It was a wall he couldn't climb. That night, the wall at home grew taller. He was hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table, cross-referencing the date of the incident with old union rosters he'd found online when Maria walked in. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, her arms crossed, watching him. He could feel her gaze on the back of his neck. "What are you doing, Arthur?" Her voice was quiet, but it cut through his concentration like a razor. "Just looking into something." She walked over and gently closed the laptop. "No, I want you to tell me what this is." She picked up a small notepad from the table, filled with his frantic scribbles. Dates, tunnel markers, the phrase unauthorized person. "This isn't just something. This is an obsession. It's been weeks. You don't sleep. When you're here, you're not really here. You're in that tunnel." "Maria, I'm close to figuring it out," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "There was an incident. The same night, the same place. It's not in my head." "I never said it was in your head," she snapped, her voice rising with a pain that tore at him. "But look at what it's doing to you, to us. You're chasing a scream from 6 years ago, Arthur. A person who was never even found. What if it was just a homeless person who ran off? What if it was nothing? Is finding that out worth this?" She gestured around the silent apartment, at the space between them that had grown into a chasm. "It's worth the truth," he he said, his own conviction sounding hollow against the backdrop of her anguish. And what about our truth? She asked, tears welling in her eyes. The life we built, is that not real enough for you anymore? She didn't wait for an answer, turning and walking into the bedroom, closing the door with a soft, final click that echoed louder than any train. He sat alone in the kitchen, the silence of the apartment now a crushing weight. Her words hurt because they were true. He was losing his grip, sacrificing the warmth of his life for a cold, dark mystery. A few days later, dejected and lost, he found himself at a dimly lit bar in a forgotten corner of Queens, a known haunt for off-duty and retired transit workers. He didn't want to go home to the silence. He just wanted to be somewhere else. Nursing a beer, he listened to the low murmur of conversations around him. Complaints about pensions, stories of near misses, nostalgic tales of the Redbirds on the 7 line. He overheard 2 older men at the end of the bar talking about the old days. One wore a faded TWU Local 100 cap. Gathering a courage he didn't know he had, Arthur walked over. "Excuse me," he began. "This is going to sound strange, but I was trying to remember something from about 6 years back. A weird call on the Q line, late night. A report of someone on the tracks down by the DeKalb Junction, but they never found anyone." The man with the cap, George, squinted at him. "6 years ago, kid, I've had breakfast I don't remember from last week." His friend chuckled. "I know, it's a long shot," Arthur said, ready to retreat, but George's eyes suddenly sharpened with a flicker of recognition. "Wait a minute. DeKalb Junction, you said they never found him? I remember that. I was working the tower at Coney Island Yard back then. We all heard about it because the operator was spooked something fierce." Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. You remember it?" "Yeah, I do," George said, leaning forward on his stool. "The operator's name was Sal Morty. Good man, a bit jumpy. He got on the radio, and he was white as a sheet when he finished his run. Said he saw something just for a second. Management told him the tapes showed nothing and to drop it. They hate unexplained stuff. Bad for business." Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. A name, a witness. What happened to him? To Sal, George took a sip of his beer. Sal was never the same after that, got quiet, transferred to a yard job. A year later, he took early retirement and was gone. Heard he moved upstate somewhere, Hudson Valley maybe. Couldn't handle the tunnels anymore. Arthur thanked the men, his mind reeling. He left the bar and stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights seeming sharper, clearer. He had a name, Salvator Morty. The scream had a witness. He pulled out his phone, the screen illuminating his face. A new text from Maria glowed on the screen. "Are you coming home?" The guilt was a physical pain in his chest. He ignored it for a second, his thumb hovering before opening a search browser. He typed the name, Salvatoremortti. He was one step closer to the darkness, and one step further from his own life. The name, Salvator Morty, echoed in Arthur's mind louder than any tunnel scream. It was a lifeline. He spent the rest of the night on his laptop, the glow of the screen a stark contrast to the darkness of their silent bedroom. Maria slept, or pretended to, her back turned to him. The chasm between them felt as wide and deep as the Hudson itself. He knew what he had to do, and he knew he had to lie to do it. By 2 a.m., he'd found him. Public records, a few filtered results on a People Finder website. Salvator Morty, age 68, resided in Beacon, New York, a quiet town nestled in the Hudson Valley. It was a world away from the screeching steel and perpetual twilight of the subway, a place a man might go to forget. The next morning, the air was thick with unspoken words. Arthur poured 2 cups of coffee, placing one on the nightstand next to Maria. She stirred, her eyes wary. "I have to go upstate today," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "A work thing. A seminar on new signaling protocols. It's mandatory." Every word felt like a betrayal. Maria sat up, clutching the mug. She didn't look at him, just stared into the black liquid. "A seminar. They told you about this last night?" "It was short notice," Arthur lied, hating the ease with which the words came. "I'll be back late. Don't wait up." She finally met his gaze, and her eyes were filled not with anger, but with a profound sadness that pierced him deeper than any argument. "Be careful, Arthur," she whispered, and he knew she wasn't talking about the seminar. The Metro-North train ride was a study in contrasts. He sat by a large window, watching the grim, graffiti-scarred walls of the Bronx give way to the gentle, rolling hills of Westchester. The Hudson River, wide and slate-gray under an overcast sky, flowed beside the tracks. Sunlight, pale but present, filtered through the clouds. For the first time in weeks, he felt the oppressive weight of the tunnels lift, only to be replaced by the heavy guilt of his deception and the gnawing anxiety of what lay ahead. What if Sal slammed the door in his face? What if the old-timer was right, and Sal was just a broken man with nothing to offer but more confusion? Beacon was picturesque, a small city trying to balance its industrial past with an artistic present. Main Street was lined with brickfront boutiques and cafes. Sal Morty's address was a few miles away, a small, blue-sided house on a quiet street where autumn leaves carpeted the lawns. It looked peaceful, the kind of home that was a sanctuary from the world. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs as he walked up the concrete path and rang the doorbell. A woman in her late 60s with kind, tired eyes and graying hair pulled back in a clip answered the door. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am. I'm looking for Salvator Morty. My name is Arthur Penn. I work for the MTA." The name of the agency was a key and a curse. The woman's posture stiffened immediately. "Sal doesn't talk about his time there. He's retired." "Please," Arthur said, his desperation cutting through his rehearsed composure. "It's important. I'm an operator. I think something happened to me that happened to him." From inside the house, a man's voice, gravelly and rough, called out, "Who is it, Sophia?" Sophia looked back at Arthur, a flicker of understanding or perhaps pity in her eyes. She stepped aside. "He says he's an operator, Sal." Salvator Morty emerged from the dim hallway. He was shorter than Arthur imagined, with a weary slump to his shoulders, but his eyes were sharp and suspicious. He looked at Arthur, at his worn jacket and his anxious expression, and a wall of resentment seemed to rise between them. "I have nothing to say to the MTA," Sal said flatly. "I'm not here for them," Arthur insisted, stepping inside as Sophia quietly closed the door. "I'm here for me. I operate the downtown line. In the tunnel just south of 42nd Street, I hear things. A scream." Sal's face, which had been a mask of stoicism, crumbled. The color drained from his cheeks, and a hand, trembling slightly, went to his mouth. He stared at Arthur, his sharp eyes now wide with a shared, haunted recognition. Sophia put a steadying hand on her husband's arm. "You too," Sal whispered, the words barely audible. Arthur just nodded, a lump forming in his throat. The shared experience was a bridge across the years of silence. Sal gestured towards a small, sunlit porch on the back of the house. They sat in worn wicker chairs, Sophia bringing them glasses of water before retreating inside, leaving the two men alone with their ghosts. "It was 6 years ago," Sal began, his gaze fixed on the quiet backyard. "October, a Tuesday night just like any other. I was coming into that same stretch of track, running on schedule. Then I saw her." Arthur leaned forward, holding his breath. She was just standing there, between the rails. A young woman, maybe 20, dark hair, wearing a thin jacket like she wasn't dressed for the weather. She looked lost. Sal's voice cracked. He took a long, shaky breath. "I hit the brakes, threw the train into emergency. The sound of the wheels, the horn, but just before that I heard it. A scream. It wasn't from the horn or the wheels, it was her." He paused, his eyes glassy with memory. "I felt the impact. A thud, you know the feeling, not like hitting debris, it was soft, heavy." Arthur knew. Every operator knew that dreaded, sickening feeling. "I called it in. Power off, get the work lights on. Me and the conductor, we walked the tracks for 100 yards back. We looked under the train, around it, on the third rail, nothing." He looked at Arthur, his eyes begging for belief. She was gone. Not a drop of blood, not a scrap of her jacket, not a shoe, nothing, she just vanished. "The report," Arthur said, It said unauthorized person on the tracks, condition unknown. Sal let out a bitter laugh. Condition unknown. They treated me like I was hallucinating. They tested me for everything. They asked if I'd been drinking. They made me see a shrink. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know I hit her. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But there was something else. Something I never told them because they already thought I was crazy. He looked around, as if worried someone might be listening even here in the safety of his home. When my headlights first hit her, for a split second, I thought I saw someone else. Further down the tunnel, near one of the old service alcoves. Just a shape, a shadow moving away. By the time I focused, it was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light. But after we found nothing, I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if she wasn't alone down there? The drive back from the Hudson Valley was a blur of gray asphalt and green road signs that Arthur barely registered. The crisp, clean air he'd breathed at Sal's remote home was replaced by the dense, exhaust-choked atmosphere of the city as he crossed the George Washington Bridge. The scream was no longer the central mystery. It was just a symptom. The real disease was the shadow Sal had seen, a detail so crucial it had festered in the man's mind for 6 years. A second figure. That changed everything. It wasn't a tragic phantom replay of a past event. It was an action. A potential crime with a witness who was made to believe he was losing his mind. He parked his car in his Queens neighborhood, the familiar screech of the elevated 7 train overhead sounding less like a comfort and more like a reminder of the secrets its darker, underground counterparts held. He checked his phone. 3 missed calls from Maria and a text. Hope the seminar was good. I saved you dinner. Love you. The lie felt like a stone in his gut. He was chasing a ghost while the most real thing in his life was waiting for him at home, and the distance between those two worlds was growing into a chasm. He knew his next step couldn't be through official channels. The MTA had already brickwalled him. A formal request for old tunnel schematics would raise red flags he couldn't afford. He needed an unofficial route, an expert in the system's forgotten corners. He needed Frank. He found him 2 days later in the cavernous, fluorescent-lit break room at the Jamaica Yard crew quarters. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and industrial soap. Frank was hunched over a worn copy of the Post, meticulously circling horses for the afternoon races at Aqueduct. His face, a roadmap of cynical disapproval, didn't even flicker as Arthur approached. "Frank, I need to talk to you." Frank grunted, not looking up. "If it's about that screech again, Artie, save it. I got enough noise in my life." "It's not about the noise anymore," Arthur said, his voice low and urgent. He pulled up a chair, its metal legs scraping harshly against the linoleum. "It's about what caused it. I found the operator from the incident 6 years ago. Sal Morty." That got Frank's attention. He slowly lowered the newspaper, his gaze sharp and appraising over the top of his reading glasses. "Morty, heard he went upstate, lost his nerve." "He didn't lose his nerve," Arthur countered. "He was broken by what they made him believe he saw. He told me everything, Frank. He saw a woman on the tracks, he felt the impact, he heard the scream. But when they cleared the scene, there was nothing. No body, no blood, nothing." Frank scoffed, a familiar, dismissive sound. "Yeah, that's the story. Tunnel plays tricks on you. The pressure, the dark." "He told me something else," Arthur interrupted, leaning closer. "Something he never told the investigators because he thought they'd lock him up. Right before he saw the woman, he saw something else. A shadow, a figure slipping into a service alcove on the east wall of the tunnel." Frank was silent for a long moment, his cynical mask faltering. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture Arthur had seen 100 times that always preceded a moment of serious thought. The idea of a ghost was easy to dismiss, but a second person, a figure hiding in the dark, that was different. That was tangible, a question of mechanics and access, not phantoms. "An alcove," Frank repeated slowly. "That stretch, it's a straight run. There's the standard emergency niches every 100 feet, but nothing big enough to hide in and just disappear." Exactly, Arthur pressed, sensing a crack in the armor. But Sal was sure. He said it wasn't a standard niche. It was something else. A doorway, maybe? You've been working these lines for 30 years, longer than almost anyone. You know the history. Was there ever anything else in that section? An old access point? A sealed-off passage? He had framed it perfectly. It was no longer a ghost hunt. It was a challenge to Frank's expertise, an appeal to his pride as a man who knew the subway system better than the veins on the back of his hand. It was a puzzle within his domain. Frank stared into the middle distance, his mind clearly turning over decades of memory, of late-night runs and maintenance reports. Before the 70s fiscal crisis, they started a lot of projects that never got finished. Connecting tunnels, new substations. When the money dried up, they just walled them off, papered over them, cheaper than filling them in. Hope surged in Arthur's chest, hot and fierce. So it's possible. Frank gave a weary sigh, the sound of a man being dragged into something he knew was trouble. He looked at Arthur, his expression unreadable. It's possible you're chasing your own tail, Artie. It's also possible Morty was seeing things. He paused, tapping his pen on the table. But if there was a second guy and a girl who vanished into thin air, that's not a tunnel ghost. That's a magic trick. And I hate magic tricks. He stood up and walked over to a bank of rust-stained lockers against the far wall, the kind that hadn't been assigned to anyone in years. He fumbled with a set of keys, finally opening one with a loud groan of protest from the hinges. The smell of dust and forgotten paper filled the air. After a moment of rummaging behind a stack of old rulebooks and a pair of petrified work boots, he pulled out a long, yellowed cardboard tube, sealed with dried-out masking tape. He brought it back to the table and laid it down between them like a declaration of war. My first supervisor, Old Man Fitzwilliam, he was a pack rat. Kept schematics for every project that ever came through this yard, finished or not. Said you never know when you'll need to know where the bodies are buried. He cracked open the tube and carefully unrolled a large, brittle blueprint onto the table. It was a schematic of the Queens Boulevard line, but an old one, drawn by hand in faded blue ink. The paper was covered in annotations and revisions. Frank ran a calloused finger along the section of track Arthur had been obsessed with. "All right, Artie," he said, his voice a low grumble. "You wanted a map. Let's see if we can find your goddamn rabbit hole." The clock on the station wall read 1:47 a.m. Below, the last downtown train had rumbled through, leaving a temporary, vibrating silence in its wake. Frank tapped the brittle, yellowed schematic spread across the bench. "We've got a 17-minute window before the first work train comes through. 17 minutes from the moment we're on the ballast. Not a second more. You got this, Arthur?" Arthur's throat was dry. He simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the dark maw of the tunnel entrance down the platform. This felt different from simply operating a train. This was a violation, a descent into a place he was only ever meant to pass through, sealed inside a metal box. Frank grunted, folding the map and stuffing it into his jacket. He carried a heavy canvas bag that clanked softly. "All right, act like you belong, head down, walk fast." They slipped through a maintenance gate at the far end of the platform, its lock expertly jimmied by Frank with a piece of metal he produced from his pocket. The air immediately grew colder, thick with the smell of ozone, damp concrete, and something else, the city's metallic decay. A single service bulb cast long, distorted shadows as they descended a set of iron stairs to the track level. The hum was the first thing that hit Arthur's senses, a low, constant thrum from the third rail just inches away. It was a sound he'd heard his entire career, but down here on foot, it was a living, lethal thing. "Watch your feet, watch the rail. Don't touch anything you don't have to," Frank commanded, his voice a low growl that was swallowed by the tunnel's acoustics. He clicked on a powerful flashlight, its beam cutting a clean, white circle through the oppressive dark. Arthur followed suit, his own light trembling slightly. They walked in single file, the crunch of their boots on the gravel ballast the only sound they made. The walls were a curved, sweating expanse of tile and concrete, streaked with years of grime. Water dripped from unseen cracks, echoing in the vast emptiness. They counted the steel support columns, matching them to the crude markings on Frank's schematic. 12, 13, 14, a low rumble began, a vibration that started in the soles of Arthur's feet and grew until it was a physical pressure in his chest. "Train!" Frank hissed, grabbing Arthur's arm and pulling him into a narrow recess between two columns. They flattened themselves against the cold wall. The rumble became a roar, and then the train was upon them. A blinding headlight, a hurricane of wind and screeching metal that tore past them with unimaginable force. It was a multi-ton beast, close enough to touch. And for a terrifying second, Arthur felt the primal urge to jump in front of it, to end the obsession once and for all. Then it was gone, its red taillights shrinking into the distance, leaving a vacuum of silence behind. Arthur was breathing heavily, his heart hammering against his ribs. Frank just spat on the tracks. "Cuts into our time. Let's move." Another 10 columns down, Frank stopped. He ran his light along the wall. Should be right here. It looked identical to every other section of the tunnel. But as Frank ran his gloved hand over the surface, he found it, a faint, almost invisible vertical seam. He pulled a crowbar from his bag. "This ain't MTA standard. This is old, maybe pre-consolidation." He wedged the tip into the seam and grunted, putting his thick shoulders into it. Metal scraped against concrete. With a final, groaning pop, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing an opening choked with darkness. A wave of foul, stagnant air washed over them, the smell of unwashed bodies, stale food, and human waste. They stepped inside. It wasn't a service alcove. It was a den, a small, miserable hovel carved out of the city's foundations. A filthy sleeping bag lay in one corner, next to a stack of empty canned bean tins. A plastic bucket served as a toilet, and on a makeshift shelf sat a small, dusty boombox, its antenna bent. Frank kicked at a pile of rags on the floor. Beneath them was a tattered spiral notebook. Arthur picked it up, his hands shaking. The handwriting was neat, feminine. It was a diary. October 12th. The noise keeps me safe. No one wants to come near a screaming tunnel. The ghost keeps the real monsters away. November 3rd. A girl tried to shelter here tonight. Younger than me, she got scared when the train came, ran out onto the tracks. The man driving the train, he looked so terrified. I hid. I felt like a shadow. She was gone when I looked again. I hope she made it. Arthur's blood ran cold. The vanishing woman, the shadow Sal had seen, it was her, the diary's author. Her name was on the inside cover, Sarah. There was a faded photo tucked into the last page, a smiling teenager with bright eyes standing in front of a suburban house with a big oak tree, a world away from this concrete tomb. "So that's it," Frank said, his voice flat. He pointed his light at the boombox. She had a recording. He pressed the eject button. A cassette tape popped out. On its label, in the same neat handwriting, were 2 words, "Keep out." The scream wasn't a haunting, it was a shield. A desperate, ingenious alarm system forged from fear. As Arthur processed the heartbreaking simplicity of the truth, Frank's light settled on the sleeping bag. He nudged it with his crowbar. It was stiff. With a grimace, he pulled back the edge. Arthur turned away, but not before he saw the skeletal remains, the matted hair, the final, silent stillness of Sarah, who had died alone in the dark, her only legacy an electronic echo. They stood in silence, the weight of the discovery crushing them. Frank eventually pulled out his phone. He made an anonymous call to the NYPD, his voice disguised, reporting a body found by a person who was down on the tracks illegally. He gave the column number and hung up. "We were never here," he said, his face a mask of stone. "This is just another sad story, one of a million in this city. You got your answer, Arthur. I hope it was worth it." Arthur didn't know how he got home. The walk to the station, the train ride, the key in his own door, it was all a blur. Maria was waiting up, sitting at the kitchen table, her face etched with worry. He didn't have to say a word. She saw it in his eyes. The haunting was over. He sat down opposite her, the silence stretching between them. Then he began to speak. He told her everything. Not about ghosts or conspiracies, but about Sarah, a runaway girl who was so terrified of the world that she built a home in the darkness, and whose only defense was a recorded scream. He told Maria about the diary, about the photo, about finding her. And then he broke. The tears he'd been holding back for months, for a mystery that was never a mystery at all, finally came. It was a sob of profound, human sorrow. Maria came around the table and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight as he wept. The wall of obsession that had grown between them crumbled into dust. It wasn't about being right. It was about the shared grief for a life lost, and a life they had almost lost themselves. A month later, Arthur was in his cab, guiding his train through the 5 boroughs. The familiar rhythm was comforting again. As he entered the tunnel, he braced himself out of habit, but the silence remained unbroken. The darkness was just darkness. The rattle of the train was just a train. The echo was finally gone. He thought of Sarah, a quiet ache in his chest, a solemn memorial for the girl the city had swallowed whole. Then he thought of Maria, of the dinner waiting for him at home. He was an operator again, not a hunter. He had looked into the abyss, but he had not let it consume him. He had found his way back to the light.